I would kindly ask everyone to take their seats so that we can begin the second part of the workshop. Please take your seats. This will be the third call to begin. The people in charge of the Zoom session, if they can continue recording, please.
Okay.
Okay, we'll introduce Father Francois Caboret at the end, so that now we can begin now. Whenever you... Please begin.
We can't start without.
Oh, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. We have a house announcement. We have a passport from Alejandra Davila Varillas. Is she here? Oh, hi. Alejandra, el pasaporte tuyo está en Stayer Hall en el Welcome Center. Para cuando salgas lo puedes reclamar ahí. Thank you.
Second announcement for the people who just came in. We have a brochure on the Observatory on Democracy we're discussing. You can pick it up when you leave. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to have you all here in person. If I could, I'd go around and hug every single one of you. This is part 2 of contributions to face the crisis of fragility of democracy around the world. Congratulations to the members of the panel that went first. That was absolutely fantastic. And if you will permit me, I'd like to summarize some of the salient points from that panel, and then we'll go into an introduction of our panelists and proceed with the program. Here's what we heard from our first panelists. We heard that there is a backsliding of democratic values, and that the list of divisive issues around the globe is long and complex, with political leaders more polarized and less able to compromise than ever before. Democracy is indeed in a fragile state. We see less participation of our citizens, which gives rise to the extremes, with individuals more open to populist leaders. There are also structural reasons to explain fading democratic values around the world. A few examples: the stagnation of living standards for middle and working class individuals, the rise of social media, which can pull parties and issues to the extremes, thereby resulting in ideological polarization. We also heard that there is a lack of trust in institutions that once enjoyed immense respect as arbiters of truth, justice, and peace. We are working very hard to build diverse democracies that treat members as equals. But there is so much more to do. We must work together to counter the prevailing narrative that demography is destiny. We must also learn to manage the propensity for individuals to find comfort only in select groups. We need to teach our students in a way that inspires cooperation and friendship rather than hatred, resentment, and violence. And finally, we need to build spaces out of our own identity expression. In our case, members of the global Jesuit order. And then with those identity expressions, connect to other identities, and then have a stake in their thriving. At this moment, we need to collaborate intensely to bridge divides. And with that, I'll introduce our panelists. Professor Carla Ede, Vice President for International Affairs, St. Joseph's University. Welcome. Thomas Bancha, Vice President for Global Engagement and Director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Welcome, Tom. Immediately to my right, Joy James, Secretary for the Jesuit Higher Education Association, South Asia. Sofia Opatska, Vice Rector for Strategic Planning at the Ukrainian Catholic University. Welcome. Francois Cabaret, President of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities in Africa and Madagascar. Welcome, Francois. And Johannes Priatma, Chairperson of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities in the Asia Pacific. Fantastic. So we will begin with Carla Ede. Each speaker will have 10 minutes. We're going to hold them to it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to extend my thanks to Father Garantini who made it possible. I would like also to thank Boston College and Father Leahy and his team and International Association of Jesuit University for the wonderful organizational work and the warm welcome. So I'm from Lebanon, from St. Joseph University of Beirut. Since I was a child, I hear the following statement. Lebanon is going through one of the most critical phases of its history for the time being. This is one of the reasons I chose to study history. Why is Lebanon such an unstable country? The obvious answer is because it has 20 different religious groups officially recognized. Well, of course, that makes it a plural society and a very divided one. Of course, another reason, we live in a region where wars and conflicts have been recurrent since World War I. But yet, this is not enough to understand why Lebanon is such a fragile country. The answer, the easiest one, but I think the most convincing one, is because it's a democracy, and it's a weird democracy. So yes, it is a democracy. Constitutions are not enough to guarantee human rights, but freedom of religion, of conscience, of faith, freedom of expression and opinion and association are inscribed in our constitution. We have political freedom for organizing political activities, political parties, for running for elections, and so on and so forth. We have also a pluralistic media and other components essential for a democracy. Yet, on the other side, we have also violence as a means to achieve political goals. Political assassination of political figures, of reporters, of civil society activists, again, are very common. And violence against pacific demonstrations that occurred 2 years ago also are really frequent and happen quite often. And justice is not here, and impunity is part of our system. So this is why the situation we are facing on a daily basis at my university in Beirut. So what do we do about it? How does USJ promote democracy and human rights? We try, of course, to do it in the 3 dimensions of our mission: teaching, research, and service to society. I will give but few examples in order not to be too long, and of course, I'll be very happy to elaborate if there are questions. So there is a compulsory 12 credits for all our undergraduate students, which are composed of courses about citizenship and human rights, ethics, interreligious dialogue, and the other is about general culture. This is mandatory for all our students. Since 2017, we are the coordinator of the Arab Master of Human Rights and Democracy. It's the first time this master was implemented in the Arab region and Arab world. It's part of the Global Campus of Human Rights, which is funded by the EU. And we launched also the first professional mediation center in Lebanon and the Middle East, and it offers training for people, of course, out of the university, but also for staff and students. And again, it's compulsory for all the candidates who want to run for the student body elections. So this is part of the teaching arena. For the research, one of the longest war in the Lebanese history is the civil war of 1975-1990. We started documenting the war during the war, and this was, of course, a dangerous task to do. So we continued, and we were the first one to publish about displaced people in the whole country during the war. We continued that effort after the war, and we were the scientific partners of the International Center for Transitional Justice when it comes to the mapping of massive violence and violation of human rights in Lebanon since 1975 until 2008. On another level, we launched the Observatory of the Children and Youth Protection and Rights. So again, they are very dynamic, and they publish research, and they were instrumental in doing or writing new procedures, standard procedures for the children protection, especially in the refugee camps. So we've done that project with UNICEF and with the Ministry of Labor in Lebanon, who asked for our expertise. So this is again research and expertise and service to society. When it comes to service to society, other activities have been implemented. We are specialists of TOT, training of trainers, for NGOs, local NGOs and their staff, again in the camps, Palestinian and Syrian refugee camps, but also in the civil society domains and the civil rights. We also are training a public servant from the administrative and military administration, especially in the areas, remote area of the country where extremism is on the rise. And another example about our legal clinic. Of course, it's service learning for our students from our law school, but they have been also very proactive after the Beirut blast. Tomorrow is the 2nd anniversary of the Beirut blast, and they helped the victims. So we received hundreds of victims to help them to try to obtain their rights. So these are but few examples. Endowed with our belief in the Emmanuel, we shall continue to promote cultural resistance and human rights, because we still think that Lebanon is yet a necessity in the Middle East, even if it's such a weird democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. I would now like to invite Tom Banshaw to the podium, please.
This is such a friendly and warm crowd. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Linda, for moderating the panel. I also want to thank Francisco for organizing the first panel we had, and by extension recognize the remarkable work of Ausal within our global network, and really emphasizing the social justice and the political engagement dimensions of our mission, and being a regional model for our global efforts. So, crisis and fragility of democracy. I'm at Georgetown, I'm an American citizen, we're here in the US, so I thought I'd say a little bit about the situation in this country here from my point of view, but place it in a wider global context, and then really zero in on one of the themes of our panel, which is how can we as Jesuit institutions in our educational mission make a positive difference. All right, first, crisis of democracy in the United States. Just 5 quick, unoriginal observations. First, we have a former president who still refuses to accept the legitimacy of the last election and who has encouraged the storming of the US Capitol. I could stop there, but I'll go on to point number 2. We see a deeply flawed electoral system fueled by cash injections that privileges personalities and personal attacks over thoughtful debate. Third, the deeply polarized parties within this flawed electoral system are unable to find common ground on issues ranging from economic policy to social, environmental, and racial justice. Fourth, dysfunctional elections and parties are in turn embedded within a sharply unequal society and a public sphere dominated by a sensationalist press and unaccountable social media. And fifth, and I could go on, I could use both hands. Fifth, we have a public that is fully aware of these trenchant problems and is expressing historically low levels of confidence in our democratic institutions. So there is a crisis that's plain for all to see. How serious is it? Well, in a hopeful mode, I want to suggest that it's extremely serious, but not existential. And of course, we could have a whole seminar about this. But I would note that US democratic institutions have weathered major crises before. Think of the Watergate scandal just 50 years ago, a president's criminal and failed attempt to stay in power at all costs. Money and personalities have always, I would argue, played an outsized role in US elections. Partisan polarization is nothing new. Deep social inequality has been a historical constant in the United States. And if you look at structural racial inequality, for example, in this country, has been much worse in earlier eras, still a huge problem. It has been worse. Social media is, of course, new, but sensationalist media is not. So I'm suggesting here that whether we look at the upheavals of the late 60s and early 70s, the Depression decade of the 30s, for example, or the post-Civil War decades of the late 19th century, crises of democracy in the United States have precedence. Well, there are many alarming things about this particular crisis. One thing that's particularly alarming, I think, given our identity and where we're coming from here at this assembly, is that from the perspective of Catholic social thought, the principle of the common good, which has actually been upheld historically, at least at a rhetorical level, across parties in the United States, it's part of the Republican with a small r tradition in US political culture. The decay of the principle of the common good is a real concern. It's lost its foothold in our public discourse. It's finding less and less resonance as partisans of the left and the right express their trenchant criticism and cynicism about the possibility or even the value of finding common ground, and I find that very disturbing. All right, what is to be done? Where do we go from here? What's the role of Jesuit institutions in the United States and in so-called established and long-standing democracies in face of the crisis that I've described, which I think exists in various symptomatic forms in other long-established democracies around the world? Here, I think a point of departure is that historically, our record as Jesuit universities in the United States has not been stellar. Up through the middle of the 20th century, Jesuit universities, now 28 in number, were, I would argue, closely aligned with and supportive of US democracy and its flawed institutions, often in a conservative spirit. This patriotic stance was partly the caution of a minority in a Protestant majority country. Jesuit institutions have long served as vehicles for social advancement for waves of migrants, especially from Europe and Latin America, that swelled the Catholic population from just 1% at the founding of the United States to its current 20% plus. The patriotic and conservative thrust of Jesuit education signaled loyalty to democracy at a time when the global church as a whole had not yet embraced, or certainly not fully embraced, democratic norms. I think I have a minute here just to draw a parallel with the career of John F. Kennedy, who, in fighting an uphill battle to become the country's first Catholic president, interesting to remember, Biden's only the second Catholic president. Biden was the first Catholic vice president in US history. In fighting that uphill battle, JFK emphasized that he was not, quote, a Catholic candidate, but rather, quote, a candidate for president who happens also to be a Catholic, unquote. And such cautious political logic and the search for respectability, I want to suggest, has also been at play in the sort of psychological ethos of Jesuit institutions, at least through the middle of the last century, helps to explain why we have not been leading spaces really for prophetic gospel critiques of the shortcomings of US democracy throughout our history. Fortunately, of course, things have changed since Vatican II, since the Church's embrace of democracy, the reinvigoration of Catholic social thought, and the new path charted by the Society of Jesus since Father Pedro Rupe and under his successors. But there's still much to be done. And a lot, as we know, we're all here sharing our experiences, a lot is being done today in the era of Pope Francis, in light of, in the context of all the global problems we'll be discussing, including the crisis of democracy. It's been striking to see over the past several years our universities in the United States, and I think it's mirrored around the world, staking out clear public positions in support, for example, of migrants and refugees, against racism, and in support of environmental justice. And we'll be discussing these ongoing efforts in the coming days. We're also, I think, all collectively in a process of reflection about how to explore creative new ways to embed the promotion of justice in our core educational mission, the formation of citizens and leaders as agents of change. Remember Father Kolvenbach's famous phrase, reminding us that the measure of our universities is who our students become. In that context, and here I'm coming to my conclusion, I think the theme of education for global citizenship, which we'll be discussing more tomorrow, is increasingly important. For today's crisis of democracy is also marked by an ugly upsurge of nationalism in the United States and around the world. And one of our, I hate to say assets, but one of our blessings as Jesuit institutions is that we're really part of the centuries-old international tradition with a global horizon. And given the magnitude of global challenges we face, from climate change and social inequality to global health, peace, and security, I think you'll agree we've got to find creative ways to leverage our network to educate our students for citizenship and leadership in a divided world. What Father Sosa at the Bilbao Assembly called, quote, university education aimed at universal citizenship. So we have to find creative ways to educate our students in this new context for citizenship. At the same time, I believe we have to find equally creative ways to let our students educate us. Our students for whom a global horizon comes naturally through the ubiquity of digital technology. Our students who are fired up with a passionate idealism about democracy, human rights, and social and environmental justice, locally, nationally, and globally. And our students who are and certainly will be inheriting our dysfunctional democratic institutions and our fractured world, and who we hope will do a better job than we have in managing and healing them into the future. Tomorrow we'll have a chance to introduce the Global Citizenship Fellows Program, and you'll hear from some of our students along these lines. We've got 23 fellows from some 16 countries, 19 Jesuit universities here to share in the assembly with us. One of them doesn't have a passport right now, as I understand it, but we'll remedy that. So we look forward to that conversation tomorrow. In closing, let me just thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections, and I look forward to the conversation.
Tom, thank you so much. Joy James will now present for us. Thank you, Joy.
Good afternoon, dear friends. First of all, I want to congratulate and thank the Latin American team, Father Luis Arriaga and Francisco, for organizing this pre-conference workshop on democracy. Also, I want to thank Father Garanzini and Christy for inviting all the 6 conference people to present the state of democracy in their geographical regions. Of course, we all look forward to the Latin American process of democracy right from the 1960s, where we are the Zelem Conference in Colombia in 1968 in Medellin. Then onwards in India, particularly South Asia, particularly India, we were quite eagerly looking what was the political process that was happening in Latin America. Of course, Paulo Freire and Nestor Paz and Camilo Torres were the heroes of our time at that in 70s. And 70s also we had the result of this process happen in Latin America, particularly in Chile, the Allende being elected and been assassinated by Pinochet, army coup. Later in the 80s we find in Nicaragua, the Sandinista government came into power, leftist government. In that government there were 2 priests, ministers, Fernando Cardenal was a Jesuit and his brother Ernesto Cardenal. And we all remember the history, how the Rome came heavily upon them at that time. This was part of history. And we know today the democracy is in shambles. The famous definition of democracy by Abraham Lincoln, it is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But because of the changes that is happening in democracy, we have to recast the whole definition. Now the democracy is the government of the people, or WF. Not by the people, but to by the people. And not for the people, but far away from people. And this is happened all over the world. Democracy is in great threat, it's a great crisis. And how do we look at this? I base my presentation on what is happening in a South Asian country, particularly India. As you know that India is the largest democracy in the world with 1.4 billion people. And the right that people have to vote, but once they finish the voting and elect a government, and the government become autocratic. I will only mention a couple of symptoms that's happening in the country. Later also I will talk about the neighboring countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. One of the things that we found as a symptom of a non-democratic process that's happening in our country is no transparent electoral system with the electronic voting machines being used. Of course, this machine is invented by Japan, but never used them in their country. The misuse of government of the agencies that's supposed to be independent. For example, the Criminal Investigation Agency, National Investigation Agency, including the judiciary. One time we had 2 years ago, 4 Supreme Court judges came in public for a interview, saying that the things that's happening in judiciary, that is Supreme Court, is not favorable to democratic process. That's the first time in the history it happened in our country. Elected representatives of opposition parties are lured with money. People can buy MLAs and MPs for voting for the government, and a number of locally elected groups have been, eroded their power. Large scale of electoral malpractices ruling parties are ignored by the basis of Election Commission. Election Commission is a very independent agency. Somehow it has become the handmaid of the ruling government. The press has lost its that power to publish and criticize the government. Once you publish something, you are arrested and put in jail. We have a couple of intellectuals been arrested. And you may remember that one Father Stan Dursamy, a Jesuit, was murdered. It was a judicial murder. He was accused of a crime which he has never committed. We all know him. But he was in the jail and he died there in last year, July 5th. It has become an international news at that time. And there is a law that is Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UPA. With that law, you cannot go to any other court. And you are arrested without and put in jail without trial. And 18 people, intellectuals of our country, are still in jail. And they have no access to the judicial system at the moment. The democratic and constitutional institutions have collapsed and have become subservient to an autocratic executive today. Media and journalists are pressurized not to oppose the government actions. Several journalists and media personnel are languishing in the jail simply for doing their job. Judiciary is crumbling under the pressure of an autocratic executive, lured by the post-retirement benefits. 2 of our, the Supreme Court judges, when they retired, one became a governor of a state, another became a member of parliament. So usually, such things happen that it affects their judgments in the, pre-retirement period. Several laws, labor code, farm laws, foreign contribution regulation law, abrogation of the Article 370, it is affecting the Jammu Kashmir area. All these are a brute force majority being passed in the by the ruling government without any discussion in the parliament. The income tax laws and the foreign contribution laws have been restrained the functioning of the civil society. The FCRA registration of the prominent organizations such as Oxfam, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, Amnesty International, all been suspended. They are not able to function in our country at the moment. It is not a declared emergency. You remember that 1975, we had an emergency declared by the Mrs. Gandhi, then Prime Minister. It went on for 18 months. After the 18 months period, election took place and Mrs. Gandhi was routed. So the democracy is at a level of a grassroots level was flourishing. But presently that is not the situation, and India is not unique at this level. It is happening all over the world. And we know that as such, after everything is being said and done, democracy is the best form of government that we have. But how do we handle this case of the democratic elected governments become autocratic and nobody can challenge? The laws are being made that format. Violence against minorities, Dalits, tribals are increasing due to the rise of hate speeches and political polarization in the country. You are aware of the Sri Lanka, what happened. In Sri Lanka, the democratic system has collapsed as people's power has resulted in the president fleeing the country. He's at the moment, he's in Singapore. The government of Singapore has allowed him to stay another 2 weeks. Sri Lanka was turning out to be an autocratic country ruled by the Rajapaksa family. It was a family affair. However, the corrupt political system has collapsed and Sri Lanka stays at an uncertain future today. Bangladesh is ruled by Awami League, which was famous at the time of the forming of the government at that time in 1971. It was part of Pakistan. There was a big war. India took the side with Bangladesh and they were liberated. And Awami League was ruling party. They are really threatening the opposition teams, and that is the type of democracy that is happening there. Pakistan has a democratically elected government that survives under the shadow of powerful army that has ruled the country for many years. So suddenly the army general becomes the president or prime minister and takes over. This is the history there. Nepal has a fractured democracy with a fragile coalition government that functioned under the secular constitution since 2015. In Myanmar, the army took over the reins of the government after overthrowing the elected government of Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. Bhutan is a democratic constitutional monarchy, which is partially democratic as it has an elected national assembly. In Afghanistan, 2 years ago, you know what happened? The Taliban, the Orthodox Muslim group, has taken over the power and there is no elected government at the moment. We Jesuits were very much involved in the JRS movement, Jesuit Refugee Service, but we had to withdraw all of them. We were about 10 Jesuits were there and the collaborators, and that is the situation there. And as Father Sosa mentioned that you cannot separate democratic process from the economy of the country. If the economy collapses, democracy will collapse. And that is what happened in the newly small countries with a democratic process. All the countries in South Asia having this constitutional crisis and decline of the constitutional morality and convention of practices. Pakistan and Nepal both are facing similar crunch, and more than once the assault of institutions and dilution of the constitutional provisions to suit the vision of a strong leader enjoying a brute majority. In short, a landslide victory and a charismatic leader do not necessarily ensure either democracy or secularity and prosperity of any country today. Democracy, in any case, is more than a number game. India cannot consider that it is immune to extreme weather events. In the economic environment, like the ones that have played havoc in Sri Lanka, the Reserve Bank of India has recently cautioned us that many of the states in India Union are under the debt burden and need to take stern fiscal measures to avoid spiraling crisis. Unfortunately, partisan politics and electoral compulsions make it impossible to deal with the challenges of rationality today. It is no consolation for the suffering Indians to be told that what they are experiencing is a global phenomenon, and there is little our government can do about it. It doesn't have the magic about it. It does not know how to pull out of this crisis. And that is the real crisis that South Asian countries are facing in the name of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Now invite Sophia to the podium.
I'm Ukrainian, and that's my superpower. That's how I start all the presentations in last 5 months, because I'm sure everyone knows where Ukraine is now, how Ukraine is now, and everybody knows how our president is communicating. Today, I will say I'm Ukrainian, and I think I know a lot about crisis and fragility of democracy. As I witnessed as a country which pretended to be democratic turned out to be a terrorist state. Over 5 months of Russia's war in Ukraine, we have witnessed all types of systematic violation of norms of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Deliberate and indiscriminate attacks of civilians, their use as hostages and human shields, execution and rapes, forceful conscription and kidnapping, attacks on medical personnel and facilities, use of banned weapons, and many more. And every time when we think that we have seen everything, we get a new level of emotions and understanding that probably it is not all. Like it happened on July 29th, when 53 Ukrainian servicemen whose evacuation from Azovstal was facilitated by United Nations and Red Cross were tortured and killed to destroy evidence of torturing in Russian prison in Olenivka in Donetsk region. We Ukrainians knew from 2014 annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass that democracy is fragile. And if you believe in it, you have to be ready to stand for it. For human dignity, freedom of speech, civil society, free elections. Things which are often taken for granted in many, many countries. I understand all the concerns about democracy, but I think we are not disappointed in democracy. We are fighting for democracy. Many of my friends, my work colleagues, our students and alumni who are Christians and pray every day, right now, instead of running companies, writing IT code, teaching, developing communities through civil society projects and creating value for others, hold weapons in their hands, fight and pray. They do it to protect our families, to protect Ukraine, and to protect the whole world from Russian terrorism and imperialism. Something that did not appear in a couple of weeks, months, or even years, a phenomena of Putin which existed and was developing for 22 years, while political leaders in other countries were coming and going, but did not do enough to stop it. Moreover, it is a rebirth of an unreflected enough totalitarian system of Soviets who destroyed millions of people in the 20th century, but were never accountable for these crimes. So lesson number 1, freedom and democracy cannot be taken for granted. Lesson number 2, war criminals have to be convicted, and only after justice and accountability takes place, we can move into reconciliation. 5 months into Russia's invasion, the education system in Ukraine and the university campuses continue to remain under a threat of deadly missile attacks and bombardments by Russian forces. If you go to the website safeschools.in.ua, you can see that more than 2,000 educational institutions have suffered bombarding and shelling, and 216 of them have been destroyed completely. That's that data of a week ago, so it might change already. At least 183 religious sites were fully or partly destroyed by Russians. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and educational and administrative buildings of Ukraine's religious communities. On Friday, July 15, at least 10 Russian missiles, $3 million cost of which, hit 2 universities in the southern city of Mykolaiv. This is just but one sad case in terrifying row strikes aimed at the Ukrainian universities since February 24th invasion. The message conveyed by these strikes is nothing less than clear. If universities are frontiers facing the future, there should be no future for Ukraine. Russia itself has unsuppressed challenges in confronting its own future by constantly readjusting and remodeling its own past while being demonstrably frightened and incapable of opening itself to the future. Sadly, Russian futurelessness has become an evil source of deadly destruction and genocide practices on a massive scale. Institutionally speaking, the world hears no words of condemnation on part of Russian universities of war crimes committed by Russian military and its political leadership. To the contrary, the Russian Rectors' Union have backed up Russian leadership in its decision to invade Ukraine. And you can find on one of the websites the long list of Russian institutions who did it. You will be scrolling really long time to see the whole list. So what can we do to avoid crisis and make democracy stronger? We, the universities, are, if I may say, in a generational business, meaning we create the most lasting and cross-generational impacts. Perhaps the most important and transformative impacts when it comes to human personalities, human lives, social and community lives. One thing which we can't allow ourselves to fail at communicating and educating is this: a free society is a moral achievement. A moral achievement which cannot be achieved once and for all and forever. It requires everyone's efforts and commitment. It's a kind of moral victory which is expected of everyone and of all of us and at all times. In essence, this is what unfolds itself in Ukraine now. It's a moral and spiritual combat for freedom and dignity. And this is why our moral victory is of such importance to Ukraine and to the whole world. We as university community are in the combat. This is the right time for us to be authentically what we are and who we are in standing for what is true, good and holy. This is the source of our resilience and the hope for the future. In this time of crisis, we are blessed by the solidarity of many people, institutions, foundations, associations, including some who are present here. Thank you. Ukrainian Catholic University workload has tripled. We want to make certain that world-class education at our university continues 100% in spite of the brutal, horrid realities of the war. We employ all our faculties and all our people are helping to provide massive humanitarian aid to thousands of people on an uninterrupted basis. UKU already works on future recovery plans for Ukraine into modern state with human being in the center. The next academic year will be transitional for us as an institution. We need to survive, and we have to help to save the country. And help to save the country, not have to help, but help simply. For this reason, we have focused our efforts on developing such a model of international collaboration which would not increase the brain drain from Ukraine, but which would keep our students abroad, but would still allow them to study and be connected with our university. We work actively with the goal to triple the number of need-based scholarships to secure the access to quality higher education for Ukrainian families who suffer hardship during the war, including displaced students. At the same time, we want to develop emerging fields of expertise needed to address the challenges of the post-war recovery and transformation. Any post-war recovery in a country will depend on its ability to retain, engage, and shape professionals. Ukraine will need specialists in so-called emerging fields like refugee studies, security studies, resilience studies, international development or sustainable studies, the European studies, to cope with post-war challenges. There was a moment when we as a university seriously considered the idea of university in exile. We hope we will not have to do it. We believe in our victory, and we know that we will not give up neither our land nor our identity for enemy or terrorists. But we have learned a lot in this period of time, in last months. And the most important thing which we learned, and I would like to repeat myself, a free society is a moral achievement which cannot be achieved once and for all and forever. It requires everyone's effort and commitment. It's a kind of moral victory which is expected of everyone and of all of us at all times. Thank you.
Sophia, thank you so much. Francois, please join us.
First of all, I would like to thank the President and Vice President of our SAR, Father Luis Arriaga and Fernando Ponce, and the whole team of our SAR for putting together this pre-conference workshop. And of course, thanks also to Father Christie and Father Mike Garanzini and the whole team also of the board for endorsing this pre-conference. However, as I speak, I thought democracy is not just in crisis. At least in Africa, it's agonizing. I come from a country where maybe we are the latest country in the world that experienced a coup d'etat. This is Burkina Faso. And for the last year, that is from 2021 to 2022, there has been 8 coups d'etats on the African continent. And in 5 out of 8 these cases, 5 out of 8, legitimate and democratically elected governments were overthrown by military people. And as a matter of fact, coming back to Burkina Faso, on January 24th, the only democratically elected president ever in Burkina Faso was overthrown by a military coup. And since the independence of Burkina Faso, it experienced no less than 7 coups. And out of 9 presidents who ruled the country, only 2 are civilians. And the very first president who were democratically elected left power to avoid bloodshed between the loyal military and the putschist. As I mentioned already, West Africa alone has experienced 5 coups d'etat, and this has happened in countries that are ranked among the poorest according to the Human Development Index. Now, I suspect that you are feeling so bad, but please forget it. And remember that first, Burkina Faso is a beautiful country located in West Africa. And it's a country that the meaning is, Burkina Faso means country of upright people. Well, not because we are upright, but because we aspire to be upright. But let me talk also about the stable countries in Africa, stable quote unquote. Stable countries where the presidents have been in power for more than 40 years. And the other longer serving presidents have been in power for 40 years, 38 years, 36 years, and only 29 years for the youngest. You have noticed that I have tried to picture 2 extremes, the very unstable countries, and the very stable quote-unquote countries. And they all claim to be democratic countries. So obviously there are countries in the middle also, and these countries in the middle, are those countries that experience some type of democracy according to the definitions that my predecessor mentioned. And out of the 54 countries in Africa, more than 2/3 are living in authoritarian and undemocratic regimes. But why is that the case? And what could our universities do about it? Indeed, by all standards, indexes, and criteria, most African countries are living in authoritarian and undemocratic countries. I see 4 determinants of non-democracy in Africa. The first one is the youth. Both the youth of the country or the people, but also the youth of the countries themselves or the nations. As you all know, 75% of the population in Africa is less than 25 years old. And this makes it very easy to manipulate the population through media. African countries are also very young nations. Except for Ethiopia, most of our countries have been experiencing democracy for less than half a century. And I guess the US experience on January 6th shows that that peaceful transition is not given, even in all countries. The second determinant of non-democracy in Africa is history dependency. What I mean here is that military regime and authoritarian regimes have become the default mode of power transition in Africa, to the point that nobody thinks that democracy is an option. The third reason is resource curse. Most African countries, as you know, have a lot of resources that are exploited by international firms with the direct and indirect support of the nations of these countries. These nations often support regimes that favor their interests. Otherwise, they could also support non-democratic transition of power. In such situations, socio-political instability weakens the bargaining power of legitimate governments, which would then be ready to sell their resources for free to sustain and to survive. In that sense, there is a scramble for African resources, including a scramble for the youth of Africa, as we see spiritual and religious competition. The whole of West and Central Africa, and partly East Africa also, is being devastated actually currently by Islamic aggression. The last determinant of non-democracy in Africa is poverty, vulnerability, and increasing inequalities. 9.2% of the world population lives under poverty, that is with $1.9 per day. But against this background, Africa has 50% poverty rates in rural areas and 10% in urban areas. So the small share of those who did experience democracy are quite disenchanted because it has never delivered economic development for them. Now, given these determinants, what could we do as universities from the standpoint of policy recommendations? The first policy recommendation is civic and political education for the youth. We need to rethink electoral democracy and the whole process of democratization in Africa. And experience has shown that elections are always, are often, if not always, times of uncertainty in Africa. So what I call education is a comprehensive type of education that helps the youth and the leaders be agents of positive civic and political change within their countries. The second policy recommendation would be job creation and entrepreneurship development. A very young by idle population is a danger for everyone. And we all recall the Arab Spring and how young people who do not have hope for a better future prefer killing themselves than living a meaningful life. So entrepreneurship provides not only jobs, but only agency. The third policy recommendation would be governance and ethics for the leaders. In order to break the cycle of violence, predation, and political greed, it requires training the leaders for better governance and ethics, because we all know that people don't do bad just because they don't know it. It's a matter of choice. But it is certainly true also that some political leaders do not necessarily have the right training to understand the full long-term consequences and the extent of their actions. To that extent, good training on governance, leadership, and entrepreneurship could help. And such training also should focus on the military people and the military leaders, because the feeling is that most of them tend to be trained on all paradigms. The last policy recommendation I would suggest is economic development. Pope Paul VI in Populorum Progresso mentioned that development is the new name of peace. When people experience economic and social welfare, they have a stake in peace and democracy. And along the lines of UAPs, we have to accompany the youth to provide them with a future full of hope. We have also to develop a sense that Africa is a common home for all Africans, and that everyone has a right to a good living, taking advantage of the abundant resources of the continent. As someone mentioned to me these days, he said, Africa was a priority during the 35th General Congregation of the Jesuits. And with the UAPs, Africa is still at the forefront because Africa has the most important concentration of youth in the world. We have quite substantial natural resources, not only for Africa, but I would say for the entire world. The Congo Basin alone is considered as the second lung of the world. So in conclusion, I would mention that the democratic diagnosis of Africa is not as beautiful as we hoped it would be. And the determinants I highlighted show how we can contribute as universities through civic and political education of the youth, through job and entrepreneurial training, through governance promotion and economic development. Our universities in Africa are called to be agents of change, to be agents of peace, to be agents of reconciliation, and my hope is that we build on the experience of our sister universities in the IAJU network So I hope that I can count on all our regional associations also for support and for collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. Our final presenter is Johannes, and at the conclusion of his talk, I hope that those of you who can stay beyond the 4 o'clock hour, we could entertain at least a couple of questions. Thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored given an opportunity to share shortly my understanding of democracy in Asia Pacific. However, I am from Indonesia, therefore my perspective will be much influenced by Indonesian context. First, Asia Pacific region is highly diverse in culture, religion, language, country size, population, governance model, and level of economic development. A similar diversity is regime type and performance among the regime democracies. At the same time, Asia Pacific has high potential to contribute to the development of democracy, for it has two very highly populated countries, China and Indonesia. More than that, Indonesia is the highest number of Muslims in the world. But interestingly, it is not Islamic country, but a secular democratic country. In the last 10 years, most countries in Asia Pacific have maintained their regime type and enjoy political stability, except Myanmar, that became an authoritarian regime following the military coup in 2021. Over the last decade, rising nationalism has led to the infusion of religion in politics in Asia Pacific, especially in Indonesia. Such tendencies contribute to the weakening of democracy by undermining pluralism, increasing societal polarization, and in the worst case, heightening conflict. Several countries in which ethno-nationalism, ethnic and religious play a significant role in politics have also undergone a deepening polarization. Particularly in Southeast Asia, this trend could further deepen the pandemic socio-economic impacts, intensifying existing societal polarization and carrying serious consequences for minority population. In recent years, the phenomenon of ethno-nationalist mobilization, sometimes accompanied by a religious dimension, has been growing in both authoritarian and democratic countries. In democracies, this is a cause for concern since it goes against the progressive trend of a deepening of universal citizenship and inclusive management of diversity. The other issue is that we cannot deny that democracy has been significantly affected by digital disruption. This includes the emergence of powerful new mechanisms of control and manipulation, powerful surveillance technologies to fake news, online bots, and unregulated contact tracing. All these phenomena are in plentiful evidence across the Asia-Pacific region, bringing with them new challenges to every aspect of public and private life, institution, legal framework, media practices, and accountability framework. In a number of countries in the region, democratization has not served as an antidote to corruption. The reasons for this are multiple and relate not only to formal rules or institutional development, but also to inherited social norms and the informal inner working of politics and its call for more comparative research. Based on these opportunities and challenges, Jesuit University across Asia Pacific face some challenges below. First, encouraging students to actively involve in variety of social organizations. Through these activities, students could naturally grow and develop their public leadership skill. However, it is not easy to encourage this, for they tend to be busy already with their academic activities, and they prefer to join hobbies and fun-oriented activities. Secondly, aligned with the increasing role of social media and digital technology in political life, we need to develop our student critical thinking. Through such competence, they can be better discern and reflect to highly intensive information from social media. It will be good if we could also encourage our students to actively participate in countering hoax and fake news. Third, since ethno-nationalism is a global phenomenon in politics, and in Indonesia it is called identity politics, we should encourage students and lecturers to involve and be active in some organization that is not based on common or similar religion, race, or ethnicity. It is not easy for our Christian students where they are minority, because every group of this activity will make them a minority in their organization or their activity. Of course, as a university, our concern should be on research and publication. Since 8 years ago, in case of Sanata Dharma University, we have established a center of study on democracy and human rights. So we agree with what AUSJAL doing in response to the democracy and politics nowadays. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes, and let's give some gratitude to all of our panelists this afternoon. Okay, let's make time for a couple of questions. If you're so inclined, please introduce yourselves and your affiliation, and to whom you would like to address the question. Let us know. You know, they say in teaching you're supposed to allow students seven seconds or something like that. So, anyone? Oh, please. Thank you.
Hi there. Serena Cosgrove from Seattle University. In the earlier part of the afternoon, Father Luis Arriaga asked us for best practices. We should be sharing them, right? And as we hear from other regions of the world, makes me think that maybe there's a time for more solidarity. And I think sometimes how to do that between universities when we all face so many challenges is a really important question to ask. So I would start with Vice Rector Opatska, and then I would ask other of our panelists to talk a little bit about do you have any examples where universities from other parts of the world have really stood up, have walked with you shoulder to shoulder, codo a codo, and what that has looked like? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. We get it a lot, and well, I can give very interesting example how Notre Dame University in the United States stood with us. We had relations for last probably 15 years already. They have been with us on the calls, 30 minutes calls, for last 5 months, sometimes every week, sometimes every second week, sometimes once per 3 weeks. But they just were talking to us, and they really wanted to understand what is the situation and how we are doing and how they can help. They also came up with a big opportunity for our students. So 30 students of UKU will be going for mobility program this year to Notre Dame. And actually, this is also something we sent a letter to universities with whom we partnered before, and we said, we call it Network of Solidarity, and we asked if you can take one student, or maybe you can take 2 students, or maybe you, like Notre Dame, can take 30 students, but take them because all of them indeed want to stay in Ukraine, but this is not a safe place for them. We are saying that they need to learn, they need to build networks. We are saying that that's not their time yet, though they are very engaged, very much helping, very committed, but it's not their time yet. And this is what we have been asking a lot of universities, and overall next year, more than 250 students will be going for various mobilities. For us, it's important that they can study normally, that they have this normality. We also have some joint research things going on, starting right now, because Ukraine is a place where you can do very interesting researches now, having interviews, talking to people, observing. You can use different methods, but that's definitely the place to explore. And just as I said, constant conversations, I value them, maybe not less than 30 students which are taken by Notre Dame. Thank you.
Please, welcome.
Hi, my name is Channing. I'm a student at Georgetown. Thanks so much for your presentation. I don't know if I'm supposed to be the one asking a question, but I hear a lot of mention of people in my age group, so I wanted to ask, it seems like a lot of weight is being put on our shoulders as youth. Happy to take on the challenge, but maybe if you can share a little bit of what your universities are doing to bridge that gap between that research and publication on democracy and the fact that youth need to be involved. Have you had initiatives and programs and events to bridge that? You'll hear more about this Global Citizenship Fellow that I'm a part of, but are there more specific programs at your universities, and maybe are there ways to collaborate on that, especially as this network of Jesuit universities? Thank you.
Go ahead, Tom.
So I think, just to paraphrase the question, what are we doing in our own local contexts that we could share in terms of educating students for citizenship, but also engaging the wider political environment. In Washington, D.C., just by virtue of our location, we're able to convene a lot of conversations, and we try our best to have an impact on public policy and the like, working with other Jesuit universities. We bring students into those efforts, but clearly it has to be the whole university engaged in that kind of public outreach, but maybe the colleagues can give some examples.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. As I mentioned, in Africa, we have 75% of our population, which is 25 years old at the most. And if you meet with the African delegation here, you would see that most of us, we are about to start new programs, new universities, because the demand is very high. So I would say that we have identified that it's important for us to accompany the youth along the lines, of course, of the UAPs, but to make sure that this youth is not manipulated by political leaders, but that they become rather agents of positive change for themselves, but also for others. Thank you.
Thanks, Francois. Last question.
Yeah, it's less a question than a remark. It's just to be short.
I'm Alain Thomaset from Centre CF Paris, the Jesuit faculties. It's the remark from a French philosopher, Montesquieu, who said that for dictatorship, we need only fearful people who are fear of the power. But for democracy, we need to have virtuous citizenship. So maybe our job is to train our students to be virtuous persons. It's not easy.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you all for your active participation. Lots of opportunities to network during the week. Have a great meeting, everyone. Thank you.